China, if a Russia, if the U.S., if any country violates the principles of the WTO, there's a dispute resolution process by which other countries can complain. It is a long, lengthy, extremely slow, lawyer-ridden process. It is not immediate. So if the U.S. does something wrong today and China complains about it, it may be 2 years before there's any consequence for that. And by then, the damage is done.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, Lalo, we're back for another episode here with Simply Trade. For those that are listening, we appreciate you tuning in to us. And again, we always say this, we're so thankful for your listening-ship, if you will. However you want to, I don't know what the proper term is for it, because anyway, Lalo, I hope you're doing well. As I know in the news, we've had some interesting, developments. There apparently are more floating objects over the U.S. of recent, and it amazes me on how we have to send up an F-35 and fire a $500,000 missile to bring down a balloon. But
yeah, it's crazy, right? Yeah.
It's crazy times. All that to say, looking forward to finding out the research and all those kinds of things. But it's going to be interesting to see what is the origin of some of these aircraft, if you want to call them balloons, and then there's some other aircraft of some kind. And in that, the infractions potentially of trade relations as we get into some of that as well. But what do you think about all that, Lalo?
Well, I mean, even the trust, right? I mean, it's just that we're trying to build trust with, well, for sure we know that big balloon, the first one that got shot down, was from China. The other ones are still speculative if there were research balloons or private companies or whatnot. They did rule out China. So, but at least the very first one, it's just the trust thing. We here we are trying to figure out, better ways to build our trade programs with them and not have to, I guess, I mean, unfortunately, I guess that's where we're at right now. It's just trying to figure out what and how we can work better as far as trade relations are. And when someone sends a balloon up like that over our country, I guess it does hurt the trust level and kind of drop us down a few pegs.
Well, with that, I'll say I'm looking forward to our show today. And folks, this is going to be one that you really need to bookmark for sure, because we're going to wind up talking about some really important things that you need to educate yourself on some history that we're going to get to talk about. And then secondarily to that, talk about some of the current events as far as the effects on that. But we've got somebody that I've got a lot of respect for. He's been a good friend of both of ours, Lalo, for quite some time. And a lot of y'all know him from especially the different trade associations and all that. But Lalo, you want to introduce our guest for us?
Sure. So, and like you said, I've a fellow Texan here on the podcast. Although on total extremes, right, from El Paso to Houston is, I tell people I can drive to LA a lot faster than I can drive to Houston, and people sometimes are blown away how big Texas is, but that's literally true. I mean, it's like no joke. So anyway, but we do have Larry Hanson, Lawrence Hanson, everybody knows him as Larry, from Houston. He has his own law firm, of course. And yes, you're right, Andy. Everybody knows him especially from the associations. I mean, he does teach law, and he does a bunch of other stuff that is a little more low key because of the gain or the audience that he can get. But for sure, with the trade associations, I mean, I think you pick any any conference, and he's just at about any one of those. AEI, NCBFAA, the ICPA, of course, and then I know, there's a bunch of other regional stuff, and I know he's normally always there. If not a sponsor, a speaker, or a supporter of some sort or another. So welcome, Larry. Thank you for joining us.
Oh,
Yeah. Thank you, Larry, for coming on board.
Oh, glad to have you. Thanks, Andy and Lalo, for inviting me to do this, and especially this topic here. It's one of my favorite topics, and you're right, Andy. This really ties into current events. So I'm really happy to talk about how the history going back quite a few decades will affect where we are today. And the general thought, I think, is those who are well versed in the history of trade law, at least from World War I on, are very scared. There's a lot of we made mistakes in the past. We're making some of the same mistakes again. So I'm really glad to talk about this. I have 3 articles on this subject that are on LinkedIn as well, so you can pick up and read on those if they want. I'll go through the history.
Let me just say is that we'll be posting in our show notes the links with Larry's bio if you want, and his contact information. But seriously, he just mentioned LinkedIn, and that's something you need to reach out to Larry. Hopefully, you'll reach out to Lalo and myself as well, and follow us, because there's a lot of information that we post out there. But Larry has some good information and some good facts and things. And he and I have had some intense discussions at times, and I just enjoy talking about it. We're going to be talking today about the World Trade Organization, about GATT, about the different trade deals that are going on out there and whatnot, and how, the accountability or the lack thereof, and the different manipulation of different things, of all that. So, Larry, where do you want to start here?
I want to start with World War One. That's where I want to start here. To understand the direction of where we are today on trade law and where we might be going on trade law, you have to know your history. That is true in so many things here. So I want to take us back to not the beginning of time. You can go back to world history and Silk Road of the Chinese dynasties, down to Rome and Egypt. You can do all those things here, but I want to focus on a particular earth-shaking moments of between World War One and World War Two. That were really critical here. It really starts with the end of World War One, and how things that happened back then affect trade today through the GATT, through the WTO, and current events, the Trump tariffs and things like that. And I'd probably begin the story with the end of World War One. End of World War One, Germany lost, and the countries of the world said that we've never had anything like this. Truly, world war, the war to end all wars.
It was the great one, as they would call it.
Yeah. And the question of how do you handle that now? What do we do now about that? And it's now pretty well universally agreed upon, historians and economic historians, that it was handled incorrectly. The thought back in 1917 was to punish Germany, take away things, build them under what was the Treaty of Versailles at the time. The world, ordered Germany to pay 269 billion marks. Which was more than they were going to be able to pay in the early 1920s, but that's the next story. But it also restricted trade. Trade restrictions on Germany were very critical. That was part of the punishment. And it wasn't just to punish Germany, it was to keep Germany from developing again and starting World War II. I'm sorry, the next World War here. So we in 269 billion marks, German marks, and trade restrictions such as economic restrictions prohibited the use of coal, iron, and steel by domestic German industries. That was very, very severe. It really just punished and protected the world from Germany at the time we thought that. Economists like John Keynes from in London said back then, 1919, 1920, we're on the wrong path here. This is a bad idea. We are going to create a situation where you're going to have more conflicts here. We're going to create a situation where Germany in particular, as the punished party, is going to be motivated to start the next World War. This is a flat out mistake. No one listened to him, and so Germany is punished. Early 1920s, Germany just can't even pay this anymore. World is falling apart here. We're only a few more years to the Depression. We have other problems going on in the world here. Germany defaults on its payment here. It has no economy or anything else here. And they were just really hurting. And so late 20s, we have more problems in the United States. You had the Depression in the United States. So Germany is broke; they can't pay their fees, and they're broke and itching to do something about that. We have our problems alone with the Depression here. We can't do an awful lot. We have our own economic problems. That says goes worldwide here. Our response to that in early 1930s was to bring on Smoot-Hawley, some of the worst trade laws ever, increased tariffs around the world. That led to retaliation here. So through the 1930s, mid 1930s, Germany is really hurting. The world is hurting. We're in a really bad time here. Germany in particular was feeling particularly bad because they would have the thought of, we're not being respected. That World War
Well,
One.
let me interject in here just a second, though. Let's look back because back during the 30s is where the different trade laws you were talking about going in with the countries were going for more, if you want to call it protectionism. They were trying to protect their own economies because of they were all hurting, hence the tariffs. So it was restricting international trade among all the different countries usually.
Absolutely. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
So just trying to set that in perspective as we're going through, there was being punitive against Germany during that time. Then you had the scenario where different economies were struggling. So then they started going and saying, hey, let's add tariffs for non-domestic sourced goods in different countries. So you got that scenario going. All right. So now let's keep progressing on. So as we're going through.
Hey everyone, we're getting ready for another annual ICPA event coming up the week of March 12th in Orlando, Florida. If you have been thinking of attending any of the ICPA conferences, this is the one you should not miss. There will be more sessions than any other conference, with a guaranteed sellout, so hurry and get your tickets today. We are also excited to share that Simply Trade podcast will be in attendance, and we want you to be part of our show. Listen to episodes 14, 15, and 16 to find out why you can't miss this conference.
The 30s were a time of great protectionism, great tariffs around the world, and it really didn't help anyone's economy. It was very much a self-protection kind of thing, and that was a thought there. And Germany certainly had to face of that. And so now, mid 1930s, Germany in particular didn't like anything that was going on here, and so. This a relatively small, nondescript, not well known, not very popular, failed soldier by the name of Adolf Hitler said, "You know what? I got an idea. I can use this." So he used the resentment that was available there and created some of his own here against not just Germany being picked on by the rest of the world, and he would cite the Treaty of Versailles as an example of that. And then he also created resentment internally. Immigrants, obviously, Jews, certain religious groups, and so we had that to the mid 30s, and leading ultimately to the World War II, and the Holocaust here. Trade law begins to weave in this, I think, in what was called the Atlantic in 1941. August 4th, 1941, interesting time, and not people don't know this history, but Winston Churchill got secretly on a boat, HMS Prince of Wales, and went over to Newfoundland and met with President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt had a cover that he was fishing the Potomac, but no one really believed him. He was up in Newfoundland for a couple of days talking to Churchill. Is August 4th, 1941. London is clearly involved in the war already. It'd be about very shortly, 6 weeks, I think, before Germany attacks Russia. World War II is raging in Europe. We are there, but we are not in the war yet. There's still 4 months before Pearl Harbor. So we know about the war. We probably knew about the Holocaust, but we did not know. We were not entered into any of these things here. So Winston Churchill and Roosevelt get together, and they said, just man to man here, and with of course a huge staff. But what are we going to do about all this stuff? And they came up with a thing called the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was an important piece of historical literature here. It was actually never signed by anyone. There's a bunch of guys getting together. How are we going to solve this problem? And there's obvious things: anti-Nazi, bring peace to the world. I mean, there was a definite. Most of it was really that. But Clause 4 and 5 of the Atlantic Charter advanced the idea that we made a mistake after World War I, and that we should go for things like economic parity, economic justice would be good. We'd be better off in ending a war by not making the same mistake we did with Germany after World War I. So there were two different clauses there, fourth and fifth. The clause 4, I can read just one sentence. Clause 4, the parties will endeavor with due respect for their existing obligations to further the enjoyment by all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, access on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world which are needed for economic prosperity. That was clause 4. Clause 5 is slightly shorter. They desire to bring the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. So very, very much a economic base. We got to do better than we did in World War at the end of World War I. So the war ends, and they get together, and they begin to put some meat on those bones. That the meat would eventually become a general agreement on tariffs and trade, but wasn't that fast. This was a couple of years in the making here, after World War II, to try to get this all together here. And the debates, if you read the history back then among the politicians and the economists and the pundits back then, there was a great deal of concern about this idea: national sovereignty, national security. We just finished the Second World War, and just a few decades apart. Really, people could remember both of them. It wasn't 100 years apart, 30 years apart. So people remember these things and think, okay, is this going to be happening every 30 years? We have another world war. We got to do better than this. We got to do something here. And so GATT was born out of that, the idea that we have to do something better than we did after World War I. So there was a great deal of debate, and the debates are important to read as well. The United States didn't like this idea. They were giving up sovereignty, but they recognized, we are better at peace than we are at war. And so maybe some degree of trade parity would be good. We certainly don't want to make the same mistake we did with Germany in World War I. Our biggest opponent, Brian, was Europe. England.
England was, there was a lot of debate in that scenario. And it was like, I guess, Larry, would you say that during that debate, it was the people that were, I guess, wanting to hang on to, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way
Sure.
traditionally you deal with it with tariffs, you deal with all that, versus this is what, even though they didn't call it that at the time, but it was more open trade type scenarios, right?
Yeah. It was the idea of the imperial protection. The British Empire had its ways. It had tariffs. You can go back to taxes on tea in the United States. That's another whole story. We can go back to the 1700s, but that's another webinar, I think. But but this was the debate back then, and it took years to get this done. But the idea was that there was a consensus early on that we got to do better than World War I. But when it came down to making individual sacrifices, it was harder to get that. And so the original GATT proposals were much more grandiose, and they got settled down here a little bit more. So we finally passed GATT. And the way GATT was supposed to work, there's certain things they were going to look at here. Let me get the GATT rules, what they wanted to do here. But certain things they wanted to do: reciprocity, that countries would have reciprocal treatment of things. The concept of most favored nation and non-discrimination, that we're all countries that are equal in some respects, and all countries should be treated the same. We should specifically not treat countries some more favorable than others on different things here. So most favored nation treatment is important. National treatment, that once you have paid your duties going to the country, you should be able to treat that as anything else. There should be no more discrimination on those things here. So it started off with just those concepts that were there. The way the GATT worked is you had different rounds of discussion. So they began, I have a list of timeline and all these things here. There's a good article on the history of GATT here. It is passed, United States and Europe, England was really the largest forces behind it, but others joined. Eventually, over 100 joined. It became a very popular thing, but a bit watered down maybe from the original goals here. And they got together a few years to discuss trade law. And there was a meeting, the different rounds, if you will. The first 6 were from 1947 to 1961. There were 6 different rounds. I won't give you all the names there, and they dealt only with tariffs. Tariff reduction was the only thing on the plate here. Tariff reduction was the only important thing. By 1964, 1967, tariffs were still on. Tariffs are always on the table. The reduction of tariffs here. But anti-dumping measures became on the issue in 1964, 1967. Tokyo round was in 1973 and 79. They began to talk more about the framework of a different agreement, and that different agreement eventually became the WTO around 1994. So in 1986 to 94, a lot more talk about tariffs still, but non-tariff measures, services, intellectual property, dispute resolution, textiles, agriculture, and very importantly, the creation of the World Trade Organization, which took place in 1994. So that's what we had here. We had a recognition that we had to agree on something. We got to do better than World War I, but it was hard sell. It was a hard sell, but reduction of tariffs are pretty good. And pretty much all of the economic studies show great international prosperity, not necessarily even. There is more attention today than perhaps then of non-developing countries or less developed countries, and whether they truly enjoyed all the benefits the United States or England had enjoyed and all these things here. But that was the concepts that were there under GATT. I think historically, as we look back, was GATT successful? Yes and no. We haven't had a world war, so I guess that was the goal, to avoid the Third World War. We improved on that. But some of the laudable goals of a unified international trade system where everyone follows the same rules, historically, we can't say it's really happened here. We have really gone into more multilateral, bilateral arrangements, trade agreements, if you will, all fully sanctioned by and supported by and given support by the framework that we started under GATT and now under the WTO. So now we're in 94, we're in the WTO. WTO had these goals, more pointed than the GATT goals of 1948, but non-discrimination, very importantly, in the sense that we don't discriminate. We are all in one big trading body here. We can't discriminate and say you will pay more, you will pay less. That lasted until the Trump years, which we'll get to in a bit.
All right. Before you go any further, though, let me just say WTO, for those of you that are somewhat novice to this, that's the World Trade Organization. And you may hear us make reference to the WCO, that's the World Customs Organization. World Customs Organization is basically, you have industry trade associations where it's like the logistics industry, the medical device industry, or whatever, has different associations. Well, the WCO is like a trade association of the customs organizations from around the world. But of course, those are all government entities. But just so WCO is that. WTO, though, that is, can you talk a little bit about the makeup of that, Larry?
WTO is obviously international border organization here, and it is by agreements. There's no, you can join the thing, but if you agree to join the thing, then you got to follow the rules of the WTO. Then you have the benefits of the WTO. They stand for a couple of specific things. Specific goals are their moniker, if you will. The first, like I said before, non-discrimination. All countries should treat each other the same, non-discrimination based on nationality here. The concept of opening trade. The thought is that trade is good, and that's and generally good. And we got to see how we do that, and whether that affects developing countries the same way that others that are there. The third goal of WTO is predictability and transparency. Trading partners around the world should be able to know what business is like, going from the U.S. to Bolivia and Chile to France and England to Sweden. This should be a transparent and predictable thing. That's better for business to have that. If you have unpredictable business, you can't really run your business. They want fair competition, and specifically they have now procedures like anti-dumping and countervailing duty. Provisions and procedures to avoid unfair competition that people can do to take advantage of the World Trade Organization and but not play by the same rules here. Specifically articulated by the WTO now is the support for less developed countries. There's a thought that trade can help lift countries out of poverty, but there's also a realization that sometimes trade hurts the problem. And so we have to handle that just right and make sure that the goals of helping less developed countries really works out. Protection of the environment, inclusion of all people within the trading system, partnerships, encouraging dialogue. That's where we have the birth of bilateral, multilateral arrangements here. And of course, now the WTO is beginning to look at the digital trade, and particularly the non-dutiability of digital trade. But just digital trade, recognize how the world is today is very different than it was in 1917. So we got to look at things that are different that are there. So now we have the WTO. WTO has a lot of the same principles of the GAP, sometimes a little more fleshed out more specifically, and that's all a good thing here. Then we have more developments here. I mean, this is where WTO is not, I won't say falling apart, but definitely has its challenges now. The critics of the WTO and GATT will say we've never really done very well. The goals, laudable goals, again, just as under GATT, for a universal worldwide system of peace and harmony everywhere. This has not really happened here. We've never met those goals, therefore it's a failure. But I think the more informed view is that there's been some gain and some good things that have happened of that. And most countries of the world, until more recently, have said this is a good construct, and it's better to have discussions on trade levels than on military levels. And so in the past, we have bad trade handling has led to military conflict.
Here's one of the things that, I mean, there's multiple reasons, but as a whole, the WTO, it used to be pretty difficult for countries to make sure that they would cross the T's and dot the I's in agreement with the principles of what the WTO was sanctioning, and more of that is, or promoting, in, again, open, fair, trade. And I guess the two that were added somewhat a while back, they're a bit controversial, is Russia and China. All right, the problem that I see, and I'm sure we're going to be getting into some of this, but some of the failures of the WTO is when a country goes in and they agree to become a member, and they should be adhering to, again, the open trade, the fair trade, the things of that nature. And yet when a country doesn't do it, this is where my problem has been with the WTO. They haven't held anybody accountable. And, even including, is like, you know what, we need to be taking you out of the WTO, and all of that. What do you think?
Well, very much, very, very true here. You have the best examples there of China and Russia. The laudable goal of everyone, including here, we got to bring in two very large economies, especially China. They can follow by the same rules here. So they really wanted to be in, and like anyone who wants to join, they have to promise to do certain things. The question is, how do you make them do that? How is there enforcement here? This is a situation where there is it's all by consensus. There is no army. There's no rules or the internal rules you have here, and even those are not working very well sometimes. So that's a fair criticism that if we're going to have a system of rules-based trade law, then there have to be consequences for not following the rules that from which you benefit. So unquestionably, China and Russia benefited by joining the WTO. They look good. They joined the world community. They are now advancing here. The trade certainly helps them very much. I think China and Russia are different in many respects here, but China wants to have a much larger domination. So China goes into other things which, by themselves are not necessarily violative of WTO rules as long as they follow WTO rules. So, for example, a topic I've spoken on when I've been in China, it's my favorite topic when I'm in China, and that is One Belt, One Road initiative. You have Chinese initiative, not in violation necessarily of WTO rules, but definitely in addition to them. The complaints about China is that when they don't follow the rules, there's no consequence for not doing that. That's a fair thing. And of course, Russia is an example as well. Russia, even before the Ukraine situation, was arguing not following the rules. So you have to have a system by which there are consequences for that. And we do have a system for that, and it's breaking down right now for reasons I'll get to. But the idea was that if China, if a Russia, if a U.S., if any country violates the principles of the WTO, there's a dispute resolution process by which other countries can complain. It is a long, lengthy, extremely slow, lawyer-ridden process. It is not immediate. So if the U.S. does something wrong today and China complains about it, it may be 2 years before there's any consequence for that. And by then, the damage is done. But there is a process for that, and it's better than shooting at each other, I suppose. It's a slow process and everything, filing disputes. And the United States brings a lot of these. We win most of them, but we don't like it when we lose. That's for sure. The problem with the dispute resolution right now is that it's broken. So whether who's right or who's wrong here, you have a system of dispute resolution.
Part of where the international courts, of trade law comes into play, right?
Not only that, you have the WTO, and they are a body by itself. There will be a decision by the WTO. The appeal of that is to the WTO appellate body. And that's where we have the problem, because the WTO appellate body are basically lawyers like myself, who are the judges at the appellate level. And after that, then the WTO has spoken. Then it's over as far as the WTO is concerned. But the WTO would then enforce whatever sanctions are all by the court. So, for example, let's say that the United States wins a case against China. Goes to the WTO, wins the case. Goes to the appellate body, wins the case. We have just won in everything. We're 2-0 at the WTO. Then we can start issuing sanctions, WTO sanctions. Since we have won and China was wrong and found to be wrong, we can now have tariffs, say, on something that's coming in. We can have some sort of remedy that will hurt China at something. It is not a hurt China like Germany was hurt in 1917, but there are consequences, albeit long, long after the offense has actually occurred here. So there are very few things that the WTO can do immediately, and that's a bit of a problem here.
One that has been out there for between Europe and the U.S. in aerospace. That's probably a good one where that went back and forth, and it has for decades actually. Between Airbus and Boeing. At one point, McDonnell Douglas was involved. Of course, Boeing acquired McDonnell Douglas eventually. But between Boeing and Airbus, Boeing and Airbus, and that dispute back and forth with Europe and all of that, as I recall, now help me out here, as I recall, there was some victories early on for Europe, some for the U.S. It went back and forth kind of. The most recent, I think there was support for a lot of positions on the U.S., but then I think the most recent, which would be maybe 3-4 years ago, the WTO ruled against the U.S. and in favor of Airbus. But
It's back and forth. And a good example of that might be the longest running dispute ever, but that length is by
that's true.
Parties. The WTO has rules about this. Okay, after there's a finding, there has to be a period of discussion, and as long as you're discussing things, everyone's happy here. And so both sides have said another 60 days, another 6 months, another year. So there's been dialogue going back and forth all this time. It wasn't like there was this delay. The delay was by decision of the parties. They'd rather talk about this. And over that many decades, there are other considerations here. The model that you were focusing on 30 years ago or 10 years ago is now a new model. And so it becomes a bargaining chip. Okay, well, we're going to do this, but because we got a WTO order against you, either way, whether we are on the right side or the wrong side, whoever's on what side, either way, they can now use it as a chip here. Now, well, you owe us because of this, so we should get a little bit more favorable treatment on our latest 777 that's going to come out here. So this is the battle back and forth here. It's a little more nuanced than just thinking, oh, God, it takes forever. It took forever because the people wanted to take forever.
Well, it looks like we've done it again. We just couldn't stop talking. We've got so much content that we're going to have to split this into 2 episodes. Thank you very much for joining us. Stay tuned for next week's episode or in continuation with our guest, Larry. Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.